There have been so many complaints about the current metagame that I decided I was going to do something about it. This is the patch that I would do if I were God Emperor of Marvel Snap. We are going to start with the big show himself. I have opted for a couple of relatively smaller changes rather than the commonly seen changing him to say +2. I think a lot of the fun and coolness of this card is located in its effect. But I also think that right now it's getting that effect for free and probably a little bit too easily, both in terms of the body that the card has at baseline, which is currently a 5/8, and in terms of what it takes to actually access 12 to 15 extra points of power on the card in terms of playing a bunch of spells. Merlin, for example, and Deafening Chord have demonstrated an ability to free roll the impacts of this card, where otherwise it would probably require a lot more actual deck building work. So what I propose to do to Sholo is to make him a 5/6 and make him say characters only. So Merlin skills would no longer count for the cards being played for Sholo, and of course neither would Deafening Chord, Majestic Wingbeat, things of that nature. What I'm trying to accomplish here is add a little bit more of a deck building sacrifice. Sholo is a very powerful card that unlocks a very powerful endgame when you can multiply his effect with a Maverick or a Scarlet Spider. But he's also just a very powerful card at baseline if you do things that involve playing really good cards like Merlin and Deafening Chord. And I would just like to see what it takes to get him decoupled from an already incredibly powerful package. Like, Merlin and Deafening Chord were already in a tier 1 deck before this guy came out, and he just went in that deck and made it better. This was already a thing that was working with Werewolf by Night, and he's just a better version of that. So I want him to have to survive on his own. And I want it to be clear, I think it's probable that he will. And I also think that it's good. And if it means that we have to put another gate on his output in the future, I would be happy to do that in the future. But my first resort with something like this is going to be trying to keep the card alive and trying to keep the promise of the card, what it is at a fundamental core gameplay level, the same. What I view as the promise of Sholo is really big guys that it makes. And I think that it's a lot harder to make that happen if we nerf his output than if we just make that output harder to access. It's possible this isn't enough, but I would much rather they do something like this than what they did to Mr. Fantastic First Steps, which felt like a core betrayal of the card's fundamental identity. This is as much identity as I feel like I can allow him to keep while taking away some of the obvious free roll situations on this card and dinging his power a little so he actually becomes more about his identity and less about just being a big pile of stats. He is more about the ways you can make his ability work for you and less just a 5/8 that gives something 12 power. Now, I've mentioned Deafening Chord already in light of what it can do with Sholo. Free rolling good interaction that doesn't take up board slots is a big part of what makes Sholo's ability so easy to trigger with so few meaningful downsides. I think that Deafening Chord, though, is also just a weird place to put a lot of power. If you look at the cards that do what Deafening Chord does, you have Deafening Chord, you have Red Guardian, and you have the Cosmic Ghost Rider. I think Deafening Chord is probably the worst of those three to be as strong as it is, because it's the one that has the least ability for you to actually play around. What are you going to do? Just not play cards that cost 3 and you care about their abilities? It just seems like the least interactive of the interactive remove your text kind of cards, and just the worst one to be the best one. That's not even to get into the Sholo of it all, which hopefully we're removing, but the werewolf of it all is still probably going to be there if we don't. So I'm taking the Afflict off of Deafening Chord. I think this is like bare minimum what should be done here, frankly. Like, this card is really good and maybe should get a little bit more chopped off of it if that has to happen. But right now, what I'm thinking is, okay, we get rid of the Sholo thing. We make sure that Merlin and this are no longer in your Sholo deck, so at least that's a different deck now. This is now siloed to werewolf stuff, and also, you're not just going to be able to play it for free value all of the time anymore. Much more of a Spider Ham type card than the general application card that it currently is if it's not actually doing anything on the board when you play it. Now, I don't want interaction to fall off too hard, so in exchange, I am giving Cosmic Ghost Rider the points of power back that he lost previously. The reason for this is I think of all of them, this is the healthiest one to have good. Red Guardian, Deafening Chord, and Cosmic Ghost Rider demand different levels of commitment, Cosmic Ghost Rider demanding the highest, and I think that if it's going to demand the highest level of commitment, I can at least put another point of power on it. It's also the one that is the most easy to actually play around. One of the things that you're really struck by when you're playing with Deafening Chord is how often Deafening Chord and Cosmic Ghost Rider have basically the same text. The front row cards are very often the cards that Deafening Chord is hitting anyway. I think this type of interaction, where there is very clear play arounds to it, is much more interesting than what Deafening Chord is asking you to do. So not only do I consider this the safest place to put power of the three of them, because it is the one that is the highest investment, I also think it's kind of the best of them to be good, because it is the one that is the easiest to play around. I was actually strongly considering suggesting this card go to 5/8. That's how I feel about it. I feel like it is just the best and fairest of tech cards we could possibly have, where other tech cards are kind of verging on unfair some of the time. I think this guy's a great place for them to put power. I showed the list of cards that I was planning to propose nerfing and buffing in this video to some of my high elo friends, and on the original list, I had Maverick 3/2, Agony 1/2. And I think largely a lot of the pushback was you probably don't need to do both if you're also going to nerf Sholo. And I think that's probably true. So I opted for saying that Agony just probably shouldn't be a 1/3 anymore. It's just a little bit too free for that card to have the vanilla stat line and have all the synergies that it already has. I do kind of think that in the future I'll probably need to be nerfing Maverick. Again, you know, I won't, but you know what I mean. Like, I do think that Maverick is the biggest thing I'm leaving out of this proposed patch. Like, there are a couple cards that stick out as, like, things I would keep an eye on if I were to actually instantiate this patch, and then what would happen in the future. Maverick is one of those, Man Spider's another one, and I think the reason I want to hit Agony is just, that's a card that works with both of them. It's just kind of been a little too free for a while now. I just don't think this card should have been a 1/3 in the first place, and I think I was wrong. I thought it should be a 1/3 back in the day. I was like, oh, this is totally fine. But the more things they do that are in the space that this card benefits from, the better it is that it is a 1/3, and the more you actually just play it just for doing what it does and not for the numbers on it. When you look at this card and you look at Hulkbuster, I think it's pretty clear that this card is supposed to be a 1/2. I think it's high time Storm got her point of power back. I would put Storm back to 3/2. I would even consider 3/3, but I think the risk of upsetting Cerebro 2 players is a little bit too high, and the risk of making Cerebro 3/2 good is also a little bit too high. So I landed on her previous 3/2 stat line. Storm is a card that has taken a lot of punishment for things that are basically not at all her fault. The War Machine Legion stuff is the biggest offender. I think Storm is a card you don't want to be amazing, but you definitely don't want one of the coolest and most iconic characters in the history of Marvel Comics to be an unplayable 3/1 that doesn't ever actually have any good synergies. I think that putting this back to 3/2 allows Cerebro 2 to actually kind of exist again for the first time in a very long time, and doesn't really threaten to do anything else now that War Machine is a 5-cost card. Frankly, I think this one is overdue. They could have done this a while ago, and they should have done this a while ago. Once they changed War Machine, I don't know why Storm remained at a 3/1 in the first place. I want to put Fantomex to 4/9. And I think this is a very aggressive change. I'm not going to deny that it's an aggressive change. But I think that when they make a card that is meant to be the sort of foundation for a new type of deck, an archetype that hasn't previously existed, like Fantomex, I want that card to reward people for innovating. And yes, that sometimes means that I might overstep in terms of how strong I think the card should be. I think that this, if it is a mistake, is an extremely acceptable one to make, because by incentivizing people to play with Fantomex and refine their Fantomex decks and saying, look, dude, this card is amazing, I am very much saying that, maybe we'll 4-8 it in the future, but I really do think that giving people a reason to go outside of the norm is really, really important here. I also would accept changing his activate ability to say -3. But I kind of think that's actually way more broken. But it does do the job of incentivizing people to build the deck in that way. Probably a lot better than just raising his baseline does. My own critique of this is that raising his baseline doesn't necessarily incentivize people to try stuff. It more incentivizes people to chuck him in there. But I just didn't feel safe raising his output, which already seems very high, in a world where something like Prodigy exists. It didn't feel like something I could reasonably propose. So this is what I ended up on. A very aggressive buff on his baseline in order to incentivize people to try out this new archetype and refine it to the best of their abilities. Because if they're not being properly incentivized, a card that could be a cool new little sub-archetype might just fall by the wayside. And I think that would be a shame for a cool character with a very cool ability. Patriot 2/2 is, I think, something that is prompted by the existence of Victoria Hand. When I look at Patriot and I look at Victoria Hand and I look at Cerebro, I think there are a couple of directions that Patriot probably has to go, and it's either bigger buff or cheaper cost. And either one of those is perfectly acceptable to me. Like, I think it would have been totally reasonable for me to walk into this video and say, I think Patriot should say +3 and have the same stat line that it does now. I would be perfectly okay with that. Either one of those. But as long as one of them happens, my basic thought process is it's got to be V-Hand or it's got to be Cerebro, because right now it's nothing. It's not doing anything. And my thought process with why I chose V-Hand over Cerebro was that I think it would be really bad if Ultron was just like dropping 5-power drones everywhere. So what we're going to do is limit the output and make it just easier to put into your curve, right? Now, the reason I think it's okay to give it either a V-Hand or Cerebro stat line, despite the fact that something like Ultron exists and is going to make great use of that, is largely down to the fact that unlike Victoria Hand, it doesn't synergize with itself. Patriot is never going to be a deck that benefits as heavily from copying Patriot effects as Victoria Hand benefits from copying Victoria Hand effects, because when Victoria Hand copies a Victoria Hand effect, it applies to the copied Victoria Hand. It synergizes with itself. It's never going to be like that for a Patriot deck, which is why I feel like this is a relatively safe thing to do. I also think that if you make Ultron good, that's awesome. I would love to see someone actually doing that in 2026. That would be a great thing to do. I think the last time I did one of these videos, I ended up proposing a buff to Ultron and a buff to Claw that ended up actually happening like several months later, and it was really cool that we could actually play them for at least a couple of weeks. I feel the same way about Patriot, where it's like, I look at Cerebro, I look at Victoria Hand, there's no reason to play this card. I would like a reason to play this card. And so what I think needs to happen is a move either in the direction of Cerebro or Victoria Hand. Given the constraints Ultron puts on this card, I think it is much safer to move it in the direction of Victoria Hand than it is to move it in the direction of Cerebro. I also think the Sword of Fushi could use a buff. What I have decided to do is make it, instead of giving Lin Li 7 power, it's going to give him 9 power. Now, why? Largely because the thing that I've been the most impressed with Lin Li is that the copies of it are kind of cool, but it's not as exponential as other things that copy and try to combo off of multiple copies of themselves, like Dakin, for example. That scales much more heavily. So what is Lin Li supposed to carve out an identity as? My instinct is maybe a hybrid. Half copies, half just good rate. I also think that the downside of Lin Li being the board slots that it takes up is pretty significant. Outside of that stuff, I mostly just don't think Lindley has any meaningful homes, and juicing his power, not on the base, but on the payoff, is a big way to get people, again, like I talked about with Fantomex, thinking about how to use this weird-ass guy that has different incentives than basically every other move card ever. 100% of other move cards, for the most part, are move me a bunch of times, or move onto my lane a bunch of times if you're Craven, right? They're all about that. Like, Sam Wilson would move stuff a bunch of times. Craven wants to be moved into a bunch of times. Hydra Stomper wants you to move a bunch of times. This guy is the only move card who's like, move once. And I think that kind of different incentive, similar to Red Wing, I guess not the only move card that says move once, but you know what I mean, where it's like, I think that if you're offering something with a different incentive from normal, you need to make that incentive strong if you want people to actually depart from what they are previously doing. And so this, much like Fantomex, is saying like, look, there are people out there who spent 6,000 tokens on these cards. I want them to feel like they made a good purchase, and I also want them to feel excited about plumbing the depths of what their purchase is capable of doing. So I think that's a big thing for me. Like, if I am God Emperor of Marvel Snap, one of my first edicts is like, if a card releases bad, you go back and you like try to make it better. You know what I mean? Like, not just like, oh, let's give it a couple extra points, but like, think about why this happened. And the ones that are on here are me taking a couple of options that I think are actually very easy. Like, to me, Fantomex and Lindley are like low-hanging fruit options, where it's like, I'm pretty sure I can just make this happen. Where like something like a zombie Captain Marvel, I think that's actually like a much harder card for me to try to make good, for example. So I picked some easy mode ones here. I'm not saying it's always going to be this easy, but I do miss when, like, for example, what would happen is like a Black Knight would come out. They'd be like, oh, this sucks. We've identified the reason why. Let's go fix it. They go fix it. And then, you know, that ends up a little too strong. They make it a little bit weaker, but you get a little bit of like different things happening. Different things are good. Different things are strong. And people who bought Black Knight felt good about it. And I think that like that kind of implied promise, like just like, we're going to go back to these cards and we're going to make them a little bit better. We're going to make them a little bit stronger. We're going to take them and we're going to reward you for doing something a little bit weird. I think that is important. It does verge on being power creep. I'm not going to deny that, but I still think that it is an important thing to do. I don't even know if I have to explain this one. Caiera to 3/6 because obviously she should be a 3/6. That's it. Like, what are we doing here? Why is this card a 3/4? It's 2026. We're good. You could honestly probably, it just occurred to me, a card comes out in 2024, it's a 3/4. Card getting buffed in 2026, it's a 3/6. Watch out in 2029, dude. This card's gonna be terrifying. But I think that like this is just one of those cases where it's like they've done so much work in understanding what actual power levels are needed for cards to be good. Like, I think a place where they've done a lot of really good work in this space is like ramp cards on 3. Cards like Wave, Luna Snow, Electro, they're finally good, and that's because they understood what it took for them to be good. And I think that in the doing of that, they have left cards like weirdos like Caiera, frankly, behind. And Caiera should just be the stat line of Luna Snow at this point. I think that's just like very straightforward, because Caiera is so often a card you are forced to include in a deck rather than a card you want to include in a deck. This is not a card that people are opting to play. They're forced to play it because their deck is going to lose to something if they don't play it. And I think that that is a very bad feeling thing, and it makes it feel even worse when the card is as bad as Caiera currently is. So I would give her a stat line that is above vanilla, even though I think that, you know, very reasonably, you look at this, it's like, why would I ever not play this over Cyclops? Like, I get it, but when are you playing Cyclops anyway, right? Like, we can be real about this. Electro has a vanilla stat line. Luna Snow has a vanilla stat line. I think it's fine. Or Luna Snow has a 3/6 stat line above vanilla. And I think it's fine that Caiera goes a little bit above vanilla, personally. All right, so what'd you think of my patch? Did I save the game? Did I kill the game? Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.